Hi everybody, and welcome from the Northumberland coast, and thanks for joining us for the OCF roundtable on the fisheries priorities for a new UK government. I'm Dickon Howell. I'm a director of OCF and HMC, and I'm really looking forward to a really interesting discussion today. We've got some great guests for you. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen for a moment. So just a bit of housekeeping. This event is scheduled to end at 1 o'clock, and the format of this is going to be like we did a couple of weeks ago. I'm going to give a very brief overview and introduction, and then I'm going to ask a general question of our guests on their aspirations and priorities for the next 5 years. And then we're going to have a discussion across three themes, one about coastal communities and future generations, our relationship with the EU, and how fisheries interact with the increasing use of our seas. We don't have a chat function. We're expecting up to 200 people today, so we can't really have a chat function. But if you have a question, do please use the Q&A button. If your question's for one person in particular, please include their name. It will really help me know who you want to answer. And you can ask questions anonymously if you wish, and you can thumb up other questions. Questions are being moderated, and we are having a general discussion around those themes. So we may not have time to work through everything that's been submitted, but we will try and weave them into the conversation as we go along. So as I mentioned, we had a roundtable a couple of weeks ago that had representatives from offshore wind, conservation and coastal communities and the Association of IFCAs. And we felt that really fishing didn't have a huge voice on that roundtable, even though Rob gave us some really valuable insights from an IFCA perspective, and we wanted to give the fishing sector a voice. More than any other sector, fishing cuts across issues of food security, marine conservation, coastal communities, social cohesion, trade and heritage. And with the UK general election coming up on the 4th of July next week, fishing constituencies around the country have been looking to see which political parties feature policies that will ensure a prosperous and sustainable future for the sector. I'm going to touch on the same introduction I gave a couple of weeks ago, that there's no denying the current situation that we're in is not one that we would choose to be. We have a series of crises in front of us, whether that's climate, biodiversity or cost of living. Our UK marine strategy indicators of good environmental status are going the wrong way. Of the 15 measured at the last assessment, 6 were failing, 5 were partially achieved, and only 4 were fully achieved, around a quarter. Coastal communities are facing increasing levels of deprivation. Energy prices are the highest they've ever been. Underneath all of this, we're seeing the effects of climate change in front of our eyes, affecting our biodiversity, our economy and our coast. There's been a lot of talk in government over the last 3 or 4 years about the policy trilemma. So how do we deliver net zero offshore, nature restoration and support fishing and coastal communities at the same time? And we're going to touch on that today, but that's not all I'd like to touch on, as I said earlier. Last time I went through each political party's manifesto, so I'm not going to do that again. What I will do is just recap on what they have to say about fishing. And since we last spoke, the SNP have released their manifesto as well, so we've got some interesting things on there. So from a Conservative perspective, the Conservative manifesto is basically the same as their current programme of government. They're looking for opportunities to back the inshore fleet when making marine planning decisions and in EU negotiations, and they want to launch a seaside heritage fund and recognise the unique circumstances of coastal areas in the allocation of grant funding to local authorities. Labour doesn't really have anything on fishing or coastal communities, but they do have an overriding focus on growth to fund the shortfall in public services, and that's growth both in our energy sector, but also across the country and across all sectors, as I say, to fund that shortfall in public services and increase prosperity. Lib Dems on fishing, they say that fishers, scientists and conservationists should all be at the centre of a decentralised and regionalised fisheries management system. But interestingly, they would aim to place the UK-EU relationship on a more formal and stable footing by seeking to join the single market. And that would mean renegotiating our trade deal, which would have obvious effects on fisheries. Green, there's nothing on fishing or coastal communities. There's lots on marine protection, marine conservation, and lots on net zero. The SNP, so this is new from last time. The key things about fishing is they want to give Scotland what they see as their rightful share of marine funding, and provide certainty through multi-annual funding frameworks. And they want to prioritise Scotland's unique fishing needs through independence, which is unsurprising for the SNP, and a move for reallocation of quota through a shift to zonal attachment, with more quota going up to Scotland. And lastly, reform. Fishing's at the heart of their strategy for regenerating coastal communities. They want to end automatic access for EU vessels, expand Royal Navy patrol squadrons, and create a sovereign wealth coastal fund from foreign fishing licenses. So with that background, I'd like to ask all of our panelists to turn their cameras on if you can. Great, thank you. And I think David's going to spotlight everyone for us as well. That'd be great. So we've got some great panelists today. We've got Mike Cohen, who's the Chief Executive Officer from the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations, Chris Ransford, who's the Chief Executive Officer of the Cornish Fish Producers Association, Mike Williams, who's Chair of the Devon and Severn Inshore Fisheries and Conservation Authority and Vice Chair of the Association of IFCAs, and Hannah Fennell. Hannah is the Chief Executive Officer of the Orkney Fisheries Association and President of the Scottish Fishermen's Federation. As I said last time, some of our panellists may not want to comment on individual manifestos, mainly because they're from a public body. And some of them may be speaking in a private capacity. I think Mike Williams in particular has said that he's going to be speaking in a private capacity today, but obviously with immense experience in the fishing industry. So what I'm going to do to kick us off is to ask a simple question. I'm going to ask everybody to speak as succinctly as they can on what are your aspirations and priorities for the next 5 years. And then we've got 3 other questions around coastal communities, one about the UK's relationship with the EU, and then one about how we balance fisheries against net zero and nature restoration. So Chris, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay. So you're top left of my screen. What are your aspirations and priorities for the next 5 years?
Yeah, thanks, Dickon, and thanks for inviting me. Great to be here. Great to have an opportunity to discuss this. So I'll try and give you a very quick snapshot of the CFPO before I go into that. I'll be very quick, but just for the audience, we're one of the most diverse and largest producer organisations in the country. About 175 vessels altogether, but we're quite unique because we have inshore boats as well as offshore boats. So our smallest boat is probably 6 meters and largest boat is about 40 meters, but we've got everything in between. All catch methods, netting, potting, trawling, scalloping, hook and line. And obviously we have a really mixed fishery in the southwest. So about 50 different species that we land into the market on any given year. So in terms of the manifesto from a CFPO point of view, we actually published a document a couple of weeks ago. So I'll just read you through what we dubbed our 5-point plan for the next government. I think it'll give a bit of a summary and look forward to getting into the detail after. But I think I don't need to remind anyone from a Brexit result. Obviously, the fishing industry didn't gain barely anything. So one of our key asks coming up to next year, 2026, when we reviewed the trade cooperation agreement, the access to the 6 to 12 mile limit is something that we see as a key priority. So getting that secured is a bit of a red line. It was a red line. It still remains a red line. So that is a major priority, certainly for us in the southwest. Secondly, cooperation amongst the fishing industry, the seafood supply chain, with fisheries and marine managers and fisheries scientists in terms of developing fisheries management. Obviously, we have the UK Fisheries Act, joint fisheries statement underneath that. And on that, we hook on all the fisheries management plans. So what we've had a bit of an introduction to is that sort of co-design approach, a continuation and a sort of expansion of that to make sure we're designing effective and useful policy. Thirdly is the recognition of fishing as part of our national food security. We'll touch on spatial squeeze and marine planning later on, I'm sure, in more detail, but getting greater recognition of the industry as part of national security. The importance of having a diverse fleet. So where we've seen some manifestos touch on just the inshore fleet, I think the importance of having a diverse fleet inshore and offshore, the benefits one offers the other and vice versa is important for sustainability, social and economic and environmental. And lastly is actually making sure we've got a good finance package to support the industry to evolve to where we want it to get it to. We've got all these ideas, all these strategies, plans, and great ideas, but it needs funding support, and one that is actually strategic, not just thrown at the industry and expected to make all the wishes come true. So let's really make sure we've got a strategic vision shared between the industry and government, and a sensible funding package there to support it. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thanks, Chris. And yeah, thanks for keeping that really succinct. That was great. I'm going to go to Mike Cohen next, and then Hannah, I'll come to you, and then Mike Williams, I'll come to you last, if that's okay. And then we'll share the order around and all the questions. Great. Mike.
Thanks very much, Dickon. And yeah, if this is a simple question, please don't ask me a complicated one, because this feels like there's quite a lot we could get into here. But it's an excellent place to start. Yeah, I should do what Chris did and introduce myself. I'm Mike Cohen. I'm from the National Federation of Fishermen's Organisations. We're a trade association for the catching sector in England and Wales primarily, with a few scattered members in Scotland and Northern Ireland too. We have members right around the coast of the UK, working right around the coast of the UK, I should say, and working out into distant waters as well. Although about 70% of our membership is under 15 metres and primarily works inshore waters, we do have vessels in every fishery, working every gear type, every scale of boat. We go from our smallest member is 4 metres and our largest is 120. So we cover a lot of different issues. I'll try hard not to replicate anything or repeat anything that Chris has just said, because I agree with all the points he's made there. I think for me, the priorities for the immediate future are remembering that the fishing industry fundamentally is about producing food. That is what we do. And remembering that's really where I'd like us to be in the national conversation. Fishing isn't a conservation problem, although it's often talked about just as if it is. Fishing's about producing food, and has been about producing food for many, many generations. And I'd like us to be focusing on that, on what we can do as an industry to sustainably produce low carbon, affordable, healthy food at a time when that's something very, very important to the nation and to national ambition. And as Chris says, to national security too. I'd like us to be maintaining the collaboration that we're now seeing in fisheries management. Under the fisheries management plan agenda, we have fishing industry, fisheries managers, fisheries scientists, and civil society all being part of that collaborative conversation around how to manage fisheries. And that's something a lot of us have wanted for a long time. And I really hope that a new government does not try to strike out in an entirely new direction just because this was initiated by their predecessors, because it's something that a lot of people have been asking for a very long time. I'd like to hope that there will still be space to fish. We're very conscious of the spatial squeeze that's been turned around fishing. There are a lot of other things that people want to do with the sea, and many of them exclude access to fish, and many of them are not entirely positive for fish stocks. So I hope that spatial element is still going to be well managed, or will be better managed in future. I'd like us to be remembering the people involved in fishing. I'd like us to be concerned about the welfare and safety of fishers and people who work at sea. I'd like to think that they'll be receiving a fair recompense for their labours and a fair price for their products they produce. That we'll be seeing legislation that considers the health and welfare of fishermen, and we don't repeat the debacle that we had this year around medical certification for fishermen. Piece of regulation that was framed around health, but actually precipitated an absolute crisis in well-being, whilst doing nothing to make people any safer. And I'd like to hope that the continual and steady improvement in safety at sea will continue and will get even better. And finally, and above all else, I'd like a strategic view. We have no national strategy for fishing. We have an energy strategy, we have a conservation strategy, and they both seem to trump other considerations quite readily and quite naturally at sea, because they are national priorities and national strategies. But where is the national strategy for fishing? We manage nationally through FMPs, locally through IFCAs, internationally through treaty. We manage spatially through the planning process, and also through the Crown Estate with its focus on commercial use of space. We manage for conservation, we manage for shipping. We don't take a strategic view of what we're doing at sea. I would really, really like to see a national fishing strategy that thinks about how we develop this industry sustainably to produce food, to produce jobs, growth in coastal communities in a way that can continue to be sustained for generations to come.
Thanks, Mike. And yeah, that point about national fishing strategy, I know people have been talking about for many years. So, Hannah, it's great to have someone from north of the border here. And before I ask you to speak, I just remind everybody that Fisheries is devolved in Scotland. And so it's really good to have a Scottish voice here. Thank you very much for joining us. What are your aspirations for the next 5 years?
Yeah, thanks very much for having me. Really pleased to be able to be here. So just for a bit of context, I'm the head of Orkney Fisheries Association, which for those of you that doesn't know is that small group of islands off the very north coast of Scotland. And I'm also president of Scottish Fishermen's Federation, which is an umbrella organisation made up of 5 constituent associations representing 450 vessels. And while fishing is devolved in Scotland, it's still so closely tied and interlinked with what happens with the UK government. So although we operate primarily within the Scottish system, what happens with the UK government essentially sets the tone for what we have to do and what we experience here. I definitely agree with what's already been said. I think for us, the key things that we really would like to see from the sector in the next 5 years is a sector that's environmentally, economically and socially thriving. And to get there, I think the key things we need are better science, both for inshore and offshore stocks. We need robust fisheries management plans. We need a large, skilled, capable workforce, which will involve investment in blue skills, but also in the infrastructure as well. And also for fishing to be recognised as how important it is for not only coastal communities, but for our food security as well. So we don't want to see fishing being squeezed out of the ocean space.
Great, thank you very much, Hannah. And there's lots to touch on there in our further conversation as well. So that's great, thank you. And Mike.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Williams. I'm visiting professor at the Law School at Plymouth University, chair of Devon, Severn, IFCA, and vice chair of the IFCA for a few weeks. My background actually is in seabed and foreshore law, property law. So my experience with fishing is probably limited to Sainsbury's and Waitrose fish counter. Plus, of course, I've been a member of the Devon and Severn IFCA since 2010. But I hold recreational and commercial diving qualifications, and my wife and I have dived and boated in the southwest for decades. And as Dickon said, I'm speaking in a personal capacity, so anything I say doesn't necessarily represent the views or the policies of Devon and Severn IFCA or the IFCA. In terms of my priorities, I'm wondering how Mike Cohen got hold of my notes for this meeting. My bucket list consists of one bucket, really, and it's, can we have a national strategy for fisheries, please? But within that bucket, there are several components. Fishery management plans are a rational response, but they're not a strategy in themselves, and they're going to take a long time to deliver benefits. And we need to bring in the economic and the social considerations more effectively. We need also, I think, to address the issue of a modern, efficient and robust onshore infrastructure. And I mean, that's been highlighted in the southwest by the closure of the Plymouth fish market. So I would say that, I suppose, anyway, but I think we need to do that because it's the only way, or it's how do you deliver food security? You can catch it, but you got to distribute it, you got to market it, you got to do it efficiently. I think we need that overarching holistic strategy to address also issues Mike picked up again, having read my notes on marine spatial planning. You know, a site-by-site approach is not going to work, and it's going to get worse as we move to net zero. And fishing is not an infinitely movable activity. So that needs to be effectively addressed. I'm also slightly concerned, and I have to be cautious here because I may not be entirely accurate, but I sometimes wonder about the silo problem at DEFRA. I've seen this at universities I've worked for in relation to research, where each department pursues its own agenda, its own function, and nobody's taking an overall look at the institution's research approach. And I wonder to what extent in DEFRA, fisheries management and environmental management are talking to each other. Are they communicating effectively? And, you know, let's be honest, if what's happened with the pollock is an example of the UK's much vaunted fisheries, world-class fisheries management, we may as well pack up and go home. You don't get the chief officers of Cornwall and Devon IFCA writing to DEFRA and expressing grave concern. And I think grave concern translates from public agency speak into what the hell is going on. So, you know, if we're going to speak frankly, something's not working at the national level. I think also we have this divide between the six and beyond the six, and that's understandable, and there are rational reasons for that. But what happens beyond six impacts inshore, and I'm not sure that there is coordination and cohesion about that. So again, I have my doubts about that. But finally, you know, in fisheries, but also now personal lives, what do we worry about? We worry about what's not working. And that's where our anxiety is. And we're not paying that much attention actually to the successes. And there have been some significant successes. You know, if I look at what it was like before 2009 and what it's like after, it's a pretty different picture. And more to the point, it's a better picture. So yes, we have to focus on resolving the problems, but I don't think we do a very good job at educating the public about what's going well. And I think we need to remember that. And then finally, food security. Well, I served in the RAF Volunteer Reserve through the Cold War. And frankly, one Cold War is enough for any lifetime. But I very much fear we're heading that way again. And I think food security, energy security are going to become vastly more important than perhaps we are willing to recognise at the moment.
Great, thanks, Mike. And that point about celebrating success is really important. And I think looking back to 2009, we had that same discussion last week, actually, about across energy and conservation and lots of other areas that there is lots to be rightly proud of, although there are lots of other things that need sort of fixing as well. So you've all touched on the place that fisheries has in our coastal communities and in our heritage and its importance to our economy. And so our next question is about what should the next government do to support thriving coastal communities and the next generation of the fishing industry? It feels like quite a long time since Chris has spoken, so I'm going to go to Chris first, and then I'll do the rest of you in a different order, and then everyone will get a first go at one of the questions. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. I'm happy for Mike Williams to carry on after that. That was spot on. Great to hear from the other speakers. and I certainly agree in terms of us communicating successes. It's something that we do, but I think we need to do a lot more of at the same time and get that government backing on what is working well to shine a light on it. Anyway, back to your question, Dickon. I think in terms of thriving coastal communities, the CFPO actually commissioned a really important piece of socioeconomic research last year, which is titled "The True Value of Seafood to Cornwall." So it's all the socioeconomics. And from that, we actually published a report at the start of this year. And just to give you a real quick snapshot of the outputs of that report, something that I still find fascinating, but for every one fisherman in Cornwall, there's 15 additional jobs across the seafood supply chain. So that makes fishing in Cornwall 4 times more important than anywhere else in the UK. So it is something that is extremely unique in terms of that person actually going out to sea to do the job. And that actually equates to a total GVA of 174 million and about 8,000 jobs. So we've got about 450 active fishermen in Cornwall. So that sort of multiplier is 8,000 jobs. And that links seafood, fishing with tourism and hospitality. So there's what we dubbed the holy trinity, really, these industries that are all sort of interdependent and supporting one another that have evolved over centuries. It's something that we have to really get a good understanding on, and how do we then support the industry to protect what we've already got, but then how do we actually then enhance that and grow that and move that around. So I think that report is something that we have certainly made sure the past government, or the one that's just called the general election, is very aware of, and the coming government will have to really pay attention to that. How do we then scale that up around the rest of the country, across the UK, and get that really firm understanding of what this industry is? And I think we touched on all of that in the introduction. But it's seeing the fishing industry as that. It's jobs in coastal communities. It's the supply of healthy, nutritious protein. It's making sure we're managing that resource well. We're actually making sure we've got a really good handle on what's happening in our seas. How do we become a hotspot for fisheries science? How do we understand the role of fishermen in actually becoming the data collectors? They already are. How do we really get that recognition for the information, the data, the anecdotal information that fishermen are seeing coming over the side of the boat every single day, and really making that a key part of decision making, of policy design? And then from there, we have a solid base that we can decide, how do we invest in this industry? How do we support it? How does it feature in marine planning and all the other points that we made as part of the introduction?
Yeah, it's really interesting, Chris. And I've seen your report. Actually, it's really eye-opening. It would be fascinating to see that the value chains and the supply chains going inwards across the rest of the country. Hannah, I'm going to come to you next. And a bit like Cornwall in a strange way, I imagine up in Orkney, fishing has a particular place in the community, and in your heritage, but then across Scotland as well. I don't know whether you've got any thoughts about what you'd like to see done to help support future generations either get into fishing or for fishing to keep their place at the heart of the coastal communities.
Yeah, 100%. I think Chris was completely spot on when he was talking about the importance of good management for fisheries, so we can have faith and security in that future and of investing in the science. I also think when it comes to a lot of fishing communities as well, especially when we're talking about ones in Scotland, especially when we talk about the island communities as well, they're just quite vulnerable. So we have to look beyond fishing, but we also have to look at social issues, so things like housing, infrastructure, childcare. There's many people that want to get into fishing and want to live in these communities, and they'll often move here or they'll try and stay here. But at the end of the day, these basic lack of infrastructure is failing them, so they have to leave for the cities. So we're losing the next generation of fishermen already because they don't see a future here. And that's not just because they don't see a future in fishing, it's because they don't see that support for these small communities where fishing is such a lifeblood.
Yeah, that issue of deprivation you see down in the southwest as well, don't you? To quite a strong degree as well. That's really interesting. Thank you, Anna. Mike Williams, I'm going to come to you next, if that's okay.
Well, yeah, I think I can echo that. The coming from South Wales, I saw what happened when the iron and steel and the mining collapsed, and we're about to see it again at Port Talbot when they do away with the blast furnaces in a few months and go to the electric arc. So Yeah, and there was almost a heartbreaking interview on local TV with a young lad. I think he was young. He's 72. Everybody's young, but he was in his 20s. He'd gone into fishing after school, married, young child, and he was saying that the boat's being sold, and there's no future in fishing. I'm going to have to do something else, and that was just typical of the deprivation that Hannah's addressing. So I'd already mentioned as Hannah did, the infrastructure and the need for a more onshore robust infrastructure. I think something else we haven't mentioned, which I think is the fact we haven't mentioned it, is significant, and it's also significant in itself, which is the value of recreational fishing. As somebody said to me a couple of weeks ago, the value of recreational fishing seems to be the preserve of tourist strategies and tourism, and not fishing strategies. And again, I think that's a definite element or component of a national fishing infrastructure. It's important in the southwest. If you talk to people, the local authorities on the Severn, they will say, well, we don't have much of a commercial fishery, but recreational fishery is very important to our economy, because people come and they stay, they eat out, they buy they charter boats. So I think we also have to look at the recreational as well as the commercial, and we need to make sure that is has an adequate infrastructure and an adequate marketing, and one of the priorities for coastal communities. And we just got to stop the hemorrhage of the inshore boats.
Yeah. We'd come back to that, Mike, if you want. I was at a conference a couple of weeks ago up at Sea Scotland, actually, where someone said we were talking about the generational structure of fishing, where fishing goes down generations and how you get out of that. And someone made the point that you wouldn't just teach IT to people in the central belt of Scotland, and that how do you get fishing as a career more widely kind of viewed, to try and meet some of those sort of generational issues you were talking about. Mike, on this issue about future generations and coastal communities, Mike Cohen, is there anything you'd like to add to what the others have said?
I mean, I agree with all the points that have been made, and I think what I said in the first time I spoke, a lot of that ties into this, doesn't it? Really, if we're looking at the thriving coastal communities and next generations, then we need a strategic view of fishing and its place in the marine space. We need to think about there being some space for them to do it in. I think we need to remember that link between fishing and coastal communities is not the same for every industry that does things in the sea. There's an assumption often when I speak to people in government that if they talk about maritime industries, they're talking about coastal communities, and that's not correct. Grimsby is one of the biggest wind farm operation and maintenance hubs in the world, and Grimsby is one of the poorest towns in Britain. The benefits of a hugely valuable industry taking place in the sea just off the east coast of the UK have not helped east coast towns, which remain some of the most deprived places in Britain. If we're going to see an equitable sharing of the income, the wealth generated by new industries and generated from the sea, then we really need to think about how we're prioritizing things. So fishing has a really important part to play in being an industry that has its impact right on the ground. And Chris's brilliant report really, really demonstrates that, how that money earned through fishing stays in the local area, helps people keep living in the place they work in, keep sending their kids to the local school, spend their money in the local shop, pay their taxes to the local council. These are really important things for social cohesion, and it's something we need to think about. And Dickon, you just, the last thing I'd say is it kind of ties into what you've just raised. We need to think about how we train people, how we encourage people, the quality training that's available, where it can be done. We have a big problem in fishing in that you have to stay in training and education up to the age of 18. And there aren't fishing courses you can go on at your average further education college. By the time people get out of the education system and are available to the fishing industry to start working, they already have another trade. We're asking people to take a risk on not doing what they've just spent 2 years training to do and trying fishing instead. And in uncertain economic times, if you've got a trade already, that's a risk for any of us to try changing something. So we need to think about how we train and educate people in fishing. There's some great work being done in the southwest around apprenticeships that could get around some of those issues. So we really need to think about that in a positive way, showing that, like Mike Williams said before, telling people that positive story, why this is still capable of being a really good industry where you can earn a good wage and support yourself and support a family. We need to help people see that opportunity is there. And then I'm sure we'll come on to it in the future in this discussion, but we need to think about what opportunity there is about control of our fish stocks and how they are shared with our neighbours and what access we have for people joining the fishery to the fish that are on their doorstep.
Great, thanks, Mike. Chris, you had your hand up. I'm kind of conscious that we've got another couple of questions that we wanted to come in. Are you okay if I go to the next question, Chris? Is that all right? Great. So Mike's very kindly segued into the next question there. Each of the parties, so I guess the first thing I would say is in this general election, you'll hear lots of political commentators say that the one thing that is not talked about in this general election has been Brexit. And each of the parties does want to change our future relationship with Europe. From SNP and the Lib Dems, who want to rejoin the single market, to Reform, who want to harden our relationship, and then lots of kind of variations in between. Fisheries and Brexit, there was a lot of discussion around it in 2016. I think because you're sort of on the front line to some degree. And I was just wondering, as we go forward over the next 5 years, how would you like the UK's relationship with the EU to develop? It's a sort of very general question. If we can keep 10 minutes at the end, we've got about 20 minutes left. We can keep 10 minutes at the end because we've got another question around net zero and nature restoration that I'd like to have a discussion around as well. But I'm going to go first to Mike Williams, if that's okay. Cheers.
Well, I'm not going to comment on the individual manifestos.
No, that's fair.
Excuse me. I have to say that I suppose I'm fairly pessimistic about this, because I don't think that the EU is going to be very anxious to renegotiate. I think the EU regards Brexit as done, and it's got other priorities at the moment, not least security, physical security. So I think it's going to be very, very difficult, frankly. And I can't see a sort of a pattern or a pathway at the moment. That's probably not very helpful to the present discussion, but I fail to see really how there's a realistic prospect of an improvement within the next 5 years. I don't think there's the appetite in Europe for that. I don't think they see it as a priority. So I'm not sure that frankly that's going to happen.
So then what impact
party
do you think,
says that?
Yeah, and so what impact do you think that then has on the fishing industry, Mike?
I think it's going to be a static situation.
Right, say where we are.
We have to manage better where we are.
I
don't think that we can realistically expect I mean, as I understand it, the trade and cooperation framework has to be will be renegotiated in 5 years. I don't think that time frame. I just don't see the EU shortening that time frame.
Yeah.
At all. I'd like to, but I think realistically, I don't see it.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks, Mike. Mike Cohen, I'll come to you next.
Thanks. Yeah, we're very focused on this at the moment, I suppose, within industry. We have the renegotiation of the TCA coming up in 2026, and that really is the point at which we have the opportunity for things to change. I agree with what Mike just said there. From our point of view, little changed. Come Brexit, there were hopes that things would change, promises made of change. I think there's been a certain amount of sneering at people in the fishing industry for believing the promises that were made, that we'd see something better. I don't think that's very fair. I think you have to understand why people wanted those things to be true. Coastal communities were devastated when we joined the EU, and in the 70s and 80s, access to UK waters was given away, and much of the fish we were able to catch was given away as quota shares were given to other countries. People saw the communities that they'd grown up in devastated. Can you really blame people for wanting to go back to prosperity and opportunity that they knew when they were children, and that their parents and their grandparents had always known? And knowing that shift was not because the fish weren't there, it was simply because we'd agreed to new regulations that meant that they weren't allowed to catch them anymore. So of course people wanted that to change, and I hoped it would come back again. And we didn't get that, and people understandably feel pretty betrayed by it. I think we have an opportunity to change things. I think it will be the European Union is not going to want things to change. It did incredibly well out of that negotiation. It got everything it asked for and paid nothing for it. We are certainly, the NFFO, we're certainly going to hope that government will, if it is going to go about giving away resources again, will at least get something in return for what it's spent in terms of access and fish stocks. If we don't, then it's going to really hamper our ability to manage fisheries domestically. The Fisheries Management Plan sets out rules and regulations, but ultimately we aren't particularly well able to control extraction from that fisheries resource in the UK, while we still have relatively unfettered access for EU boats. And there is just such a clear disparity in some parts of the country that it really is holding back the development of local fisheries. We see the inshore fisheries in the southeast struggling hugely with a lack of catch. And yet along the 6 mile line, there's regularly a dozen or more large EU vessels fishing around the clock all year round. It's not that there are no fish there to be caught, simply they are not reaching the inshore region. And we can't tackle that. And we can't, for all the ambitions that parties may have to back the inshore fisheries, and I would definitely support that. They just don't have it in their gift to do that while there's unfettered access to what is an EU offshore fishery right up to our 6 mile line. So we need to think much more carefully about access and quota shares if we are going to properly manage fisheries in the UK for the benefit of UK coastal communities.
Brilliant. Thanks, Mike. Really eloquently put. Thank you. Hannah, I'm going to come to you next, and then Chris, I'll come to you last, if that's okay.
Yeah, Brexit as well for us has been something that we've been thinking about long and hard for the past goodness knows how many years. In Orkney, Brexit had a very bad effect on us because we are mainly inshore fisheries, fishing crab and lobster, and our main market was the EU. So that transition period was really difficult. Having said that, looking at where we are now and then looking at 2026, where we're going to be reviewing the TCA, what we don't want is to lose what little that we did gain. So for us, we would like to see improving the UK's position as an independent coastal state, so we have more ability to make decisions about fisheries management. We don't want to lose what little gains we had, particularly when it comes to fisheries management and FMPs.
Yeah, I think that's another message that comes through, Hannah, quite clearly, is that the FMPs are a good thing, and the way that we're managing things at the moment is better. So that, yes, that's a really good point. Chris.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, and echo the remarks already made. And I think we have to remember that whatever we do with the EU is always going to be a negotiation. It's not a I win, you lose situation. That's not got us anywhere. And managing our expectations, which we've certainly got a handle on since what's happened in recent years. But in respect of that, fish obviously are not so caring about borders and boundaries, a line in the sand between two countries. So in the sense of a negotiation, then we clearly need to put something on the table and ask for something back. And the fact that fish do swim and things are on the move, climate change, some of the comments you made in your introduction, Dickon, our members are the ones that are regularly reporting we're seeing something new, things that were here are now moving north. So it's really important we have a scientific fisheries management relationship with the EU, because harmonization of anything, it makes sense in respect of what I've said. So if we're asking for something, I think we have got something to offer. We're doing things very differently under the UK Fisheries Act. The Fisheries Management Plan model is something that's evolving, and industry are really engaged with and committed, right from the quayside through to our office and through to discussing things at a national level with Mike. So if the EU want any involvement or understanding of what we're doing, I think we've got something to bargain and something to actually open and discuss. And then from a scientific point of view, we're all seeing things change. So let's make sure we've got good, positive dialogue between fishery scientists that translates through to sensible policy on these things, because it makes a lot more sense to work collectively on that stuff. It's very complex, complicated, and evolving. So let's share information where we can to see it as a whole.
Yeah, good communication is always essential, isn't it, Chris? Yeah, thank you. Mike, you've got your hand up. Do you want to come in on that again?
Yeah, I mean, what personally would I like to see? I'd like to see EU boats excluded from the 12. Are we going to get it? No, I don't think we are. But I think Hannah made an interesting point about access to markets, and particularly improving the access for perishable material. And I think that is a very possible gain. So when I say I don't think the EU is going to want to change, I think there are small wins we can get this time round, which could have quite an important economic effect. But I mean, while I'd like Mike Cohen's wish lists to come about, I think we have to manage expectations. I mean, there was ridiculous expectation management around Brexit, and I think we have to recognise that.
Yeah, and not just in fisheries either, across everything. I think that was the case. Okay, we've got 11 minutes left. So the last question is really sort of bringing us, I guess, a little bit full circle to the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago. All of the major political parties across the UK have got big ambitions, both for net zero and nature restoration, to meet the needs of the biodiversity and climate crisis. How do you see the future for fisheries and food security sitting alongside these ambitions, I guess? And Hannah, I'm going to come to you first, if that's okay.
Thanks. I think this is such a central issue. I think often in conversations and discussions, it's often pitted as fisheries versus conservation, or fisheries versus what we need to do to tackle climate change. And that's just not the case at all. I think as a sector, we're at the sharp end of climate change. We're already seeing changes in our environments, in the patterns of our fish. In Orkney, we're seeing changes in the movement and the breeding behaviour of crab. So for us, climate change is already here, it's already happening, and we feel like we're waiting for management and policymakers to catch up, actually. So for us, we really need to see more flexible management. Chris at the start made that really good point that fishermen are data collectors already. We need to be harnessing their knowledge and their experience and using that, not just in fishing, but there's loads of sectors that can benefit from the kind of data that we collect and the knowledge we have. I think this kind of fishing versus conservation or fishing versus climate change narrative that we have as well is really damaging for the fishing sector. Because too often now that when we're talking about climate change and what we need to do, people are talking about net zero and wind farms and renewable energy, and they want to introduce them at the cost of fishing. And there is definitely a place for renewable energy. It is really important to get to net zero, but it can't come at the cost of fishing, which is a really climate smart food production. So what I'd really urge is everyone to think about how to balance these things. And that's the key for going forward, because we can't have one thing without the other thing.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. Really well put. Chris, I'm going to come to you next, and then Mike Cohen, and then Mike Williams last, if that's okay. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. I think the one of the biggest issues here, and we're certainly right amongst it at the moment in the Celtic Sea with marine protected areas and the Crown Estate's eye on, already pushing through 4.5 gigawatts and announcing an additional 12 gigawatts, which would effectively bring the fishing industry to a pretty swift end. So those plans already are out there. And where does fishing feature in that? Well, as a non-statutory consultee, it's a soft constraint. It's something that if they feel like they want to talk to us, they can, but they don't have to. So it's our job, and which we're doing effectively, I feel, through the NFFO and the Scottish Fishermen's Federation since their publication of a spatial squeeze report, which highlighted some scenarios for the next 30 years, which illustrate this really well. So it's up to the next government to see the fishing industry as a food security industry, jobs in coastal communities, as we've already said multiple times. If it takes that vision and decides to make the fishing industry a statutory consultee, we become involved much earlier in the marine planning process. And that's where it's gone wrong in the past. It's being asked when all the decisions are made and the lines are drawn on the maps, and you get 0.1% of a chance to change one little line somewhere, which doesn't really make a difference. So, but at the same time, we can be a really helpful partner in this process. So we're not anti-renewables, not anti-marine protected areas. If you bring us in early, we can accelerate the process by giving knowledge, information, and saving all the pain that can disrupt consultations and planning applications. So it's a recommendation of us to bring us in early, have that sensible conversation. Let's map out food, energy, nature recovery. What do we need as a nation, and then actually have those early discussions before it's too late. So there's a good outcome here. There's a real positive conversation to be had. It's happening quietly, but if the government really get a handle on it, I think we can make a lot of progress collectively. The risk here at the moment is within DEFRA. We have marine and fisheries. I think we mentioned about silos already. So fisheries, we can talk all day long. Great engagement, very active discussions with fisheries managers, policy scientists. Marine protected areas, offshore planning. The fishing industry is vaguely sort of connected to that conversation. Completely different relationship. So the next government, if they get a better alignment and actually just have marine, which fishing becomes a part of, the whole thing shifts in a sensible direction. Thanks.
Yeah, that does make sense, Chris. And I have heard people talk about that division across marine and fisheries, and whether it should just be ocean or marine, as you say, is there's quite a lot to a name, isn't there? Actually, I think just in terms of identity and what people should and shouldn't be doing. But that collective action, and Mike, you've talked before about a national strategy, which seems to sort of feed into that of what Chris was saying. But do you have any thoughts on that or anything else around this kind of topic?
Yeah, I think we need to bear in mind the positive contribution that fishing can make in terms of approaching net zero and the climate crisis. We are one of the lowest carbon forms of protein in the human diet. You don't need to clear cut rainforest to plant it. You don't need to ship it to the other side of the world. You don't need to process it. It's free range, wild caught, local, low food miles. And it's an important contribution to a lower carbon diet and a healthy diet and an affordable diet for the UK. And we need to bear that in mind. We are part of the solution here. That's really, really valuable. And in terms of net zero energy production, we clearly have an important conversation, as Chris has just said, to participate in around siting of offshore wind, which clearly has its part. But I also kind of urge a little bit of caution. Offshore wind is not the permanent solution to the problem of releasing too much carbon. The problem is we use more energy than we sustainably can do. And building offshore wind farms, which have a lifespan of 20 to 25 years, is a stopgap in solving that problem. It allows us to kick the can down the road another 20, 25 years. The can is still there. We're still using more energy than we can sustainably produce. So I want us to be really, really cautious. If we are deciding to buy ourselves another 20 or 25 years before we actually try and solve that problem, I'm not sure it's a good idea to be damaging our food production capacity while we do that. If we damage fish breeding grounds, migration routes, and fishing grounds, and in order to get another brief reprieve from the fact that we are living unsustainably, we damage our food production capacity, then I'm not sure we are really being terribly sensible. At the end of the day, you cannot eat a wind turbine even after it's been decommissioned. And we are going to need to think very carefully about what it is we are giving up in order to buy ourselves a little bit more time before we start to really tackle the real issue of how we live more sustainably. And I'd argue fishing is part of living more sustainably. It's not the enemy of that idea.
Thanks, Mike. Some really interesting. There's a thing about conscious decision making, isn't there? About making sure that every time you're making a decision, you're doing it consciously with understanding all the different impacts of it. Mike Williams, we've got 3 minutes left. So we started with 3 minutes for you. I'm going to end with 3 minutes for you, if that's okay.
Right. Okay, so Hannah's been reading my notes as well then. Yeah, Hannah's right. This climate change isn't going to happen. It's happened. And the fishermen are certainly down in the southwest have got ample evidence of that. I turn on the TV, I open the newspaper every day, and I read about this tension between fishing and environment conservation. And then I chair IFCA meetings, and you know what? I don't find any trace of it whatsoever. I've got environmental NGO people sitting around the table with recreational and commercial fishermen, and they're all on message and they're all compromising. And I just don't see that tension happening. But it's not the narrative that the public are getting. And more damagingly, I don't think it's the narrative the civil servants and ministers are getting. And that's the bit that concerns me. I think Mike's right about the temporary fix with wind farms, but I would say in a way it's probably inevitable while we develop new technologies. I mean, hopefully one day we'll have nuclear fusion, not fission, and it'll be fine, but it's some way off. And yeah, we've just gone through the public inquiry for Hinckley with EDF. And you know what? Fishing wasn't even on the agenda originally in that process. And Devon and Severn IFCA had to muscle in and get that before the public inquiry. So I think that marine spatial planning and energy is going to be a real issue. And finally, food security. Well, as I said before, I've got the horrible feeling we're going to sleepwalk into this, and then all of a sudden it's going to become something that the government is really anxious and aware of. And I think we really need to push that heavily, because I think sadly it is going to be a very real issue in the next decade. I don't know if I've exhausted my 3 minutes or not.
You're spot on, Mike. Thank you very much. You've taken us right to time. The only thing that's left for me to say is thank you to all of you for a fascinating discussion. And I hope everyone who was listening found it as interesting as I did to be part of. We will be putting this discussion up on our YouTube channel hopefully before the general election. We'll need to make sure that our tech people can do that. But yes, thank you all very much for joining today, and I hope you all have a great weekend. And yes, speak to you soon. Cheers. Thank you.
Thanks.